Hi, my name is Taylor Socks, and this is my final video for my Utopia project on April 7th, 2014. I love the MPhil program. I don't know where I would be if I didn't have the vast array of content that interdisciplinary studies lends me, as well as the option for artistic fervor that have been allowed in my evaluations. That being said, for most things that I love, I like to change them and make them better. So that's why this semester I decided to explore a pedagogical utopia in terms of the MPhil program. Now, I actually want this to work, and I do want to make changes, and so that's why a good number of parts of my project have been specifically aimed at making the actual changes and producing the work that I think is going to be necessary to convince people to allow this program to grow. One thing that I found when I started to do this particular kind of work was that the formats that I felt that I needed to adhere to, such as a letter to a professor or specific policy proposals, didn't quite fit in well with philosophical analysis. And even when there was more room, say perhaps within my policy proposals, it was very tough to try to figure out exactly what proposals were lining up with what philosophy that I was thinking of. My response to this is this particular video, where I'm going to take you through the basic arenas of philosophy that I'm playing in, and show you why all of these are very important in terms of the development of the MPhil program. So, I've got three main arenas. We've got dialogue, democratic theory, and anti-oppressive education. I believe that each one of these are incredibly necessary to keep in mind when we are developing changes from that, and all of the recommendations that I have, as well as the rest of the work that is within this project, are all working from the concepts that I'm going to be talking about now. So, the first arena is dialogue. Thinkers who are talking about this, we've got Buckton, we've got David Bohm, we've got William Isaacs, Adam Kahane, Peter Senge, and Daniel Yankelovich. These folks are all talking more or less about the same sort of particular process-oriented practice of gathering together, being able to share in the realities of each other and coming to some sort of communal understanding about what is going on, what's important, and so forth. Now, these specific dialogic arenas can be used for a particular content or goal, but that is not really particularly necessary, and people like, say, David Bohm would advocate against using dialogue for specific content before the dialogic process was actually fully intact. So these guys are really talking about a couple of things here. The first big thing that sticks out is this idea of trust. You can't actually sit down and talk to each other about things unless you have a particular level of trust. And this is fairly difficult to maintain. But in order for collaboration to happen, the trust actually has to be there. Now, there's also a couple of other aspects to dialogue. One is this idea of incompleteness, and that it is actually more difficult to come and share ideas when you have a particular solidified idea of how something should look or how something should be. The framework of incompleteness is always hovering over dialogic spaces, simply because it is this incompleteness that better allows communal facilitation and development of ideas. Within this framework of dialogue, there are a couple of subcategories that we can talk about that I've done some investigation in. The first is collaborative learning, which is specifically focusing on, okay, so how do we actually blend this idea of a dialogic space with how we can actually learn? We can borrow ideas of the trust and of incompleteness, but also further our specific learning goals in terms of developing content and shared understanding of what's going on. The Harkness method is a specific way of going about this, which was developed at a school called Exeter from a donation by Edward Harkness, who basically said, look, I want a space where people can sit around a table, be able to look at each other, and actually come to some sort of understanding about what's going on. The Harkness method was employed in my high school in my final 2 years that I was there, and has been since developed to expand through the entire social sciences and humanities courses offered in my high school. The World Cafe is simply another methodology to go about this, where instead of having one table, you actually have multiple tables. This is better in a larger group, where you are actually moving around and then coming together and sharing ideas from the smaller groups to the larger groups as well. This World Cafe is particularly helpful if we ever do want to expand practices of the MPhil program beyond the single classroom that we have. It is through dialogue that I think we can actually develop these shared communal understandings of of the material that we're interacting with, and actually bring out the agency in students and get them to participate within the co-creation of knowledge and understanding. Now, dialogue only functions properly if you have good democratic theory that's underpinning it. Democratic theory essentially points to the right to participate in any decisions that affect one's life. Here I'm borrowing from the theory of Hannah Arendt, Tom Attlee, Dewey, Jane Mansbridge, and Elinor Ostrom. Here we're focusing on the right to participate in terms of decision-making, governance and power relationships that go on within, and specifically the development of formalized rules that are going to help democracy function better, that is actually going to allow people equitable voice in the decisions that are going on. We're looking here specifically to develop communal agency as well, so that we can actually have legitimate communities that have grounding within individuals, instead of, let's say, representative systems which have questionable tags back to what's going on. Now, there are three different subcategories here that I have. First is democratic schools, that I think are particularly pertinent because they focus on how to involve the entire community within decisions that are going on within the schools, be it curriculum, the length of the school day, the materials that are studied, and so forth. Bean and Apple are the main two who have been talking about this for a while. They have an excellent book on democratic schools specifically. Jane Mansbridge and Elinor Ostrom are looking specifically at town hall meetings as actual places where people are gathering and participating within democratic processes. It's very difficult to gather and make decisions, and town hall meetings, and what has been gleaned from especially Mansbridge's research, have helped in sort of better unpacking the types of rules and analyzing the power dynamics that have come from those. Finally, I did a fair amount of research on the council system, developed throughout 20th century Europe based on the premises of the Paris Commune, where people would gather and make decisions about their institutions, and it would funnel up into the level of actual governance, which is why they were so often occurring at times of revolution, and really focusing on how to gain legitimate action against governments who actually had the threat of violence on their side. Democratic theory is very much informing how I'm going about things. I don't want to be a tyrant, and so it is my adherence to what I've learned within democratic theory that is helpful in making sure that I'm going about things in a reasonable way, and also lends a lot of support to the dialogic theory that has come that came afterwards. However, democratic theory hasn't done a great job necessarily at recognizing how identity plays into politics, and this is where anti-oppressive education comes in. Here I'm mainly working from Kevin Kumushiro's work, Troubling Education, as well as a few other of his pieces, and he's specifically looking at how to take apart our education systems that were built up around an earlier time, and thus reinforcing particular types of privilege, how to take them apart and make them more meaningful for and reflective of the actual members of our community who are around. Within the scope of anti-oppressive education, we've got a few other genres which speak nicely with Kumushiro's work. We have Delpit and Fine's work on silencing, who are looking at urban schools and how low-income immigrant, non-white families and students often get their voices closed down before they're ever able to participate in a full conversation, just because of the languages that particular institutions use. queer theory comes in, and with the work of Butler and Dahl especially gives us some good analysis of how to start queering citation and sourcing, the relationship between subject and object, and the distinction between individual and collaborative learning that is actually seeking to unpack the privilege that has been enshrined within academia up until this point. I'm also working with some trans theory, mostly with Kate Bornstein's and Bergman's Gender Outlaws, The Next Generation, which is a collection of stories, articles, comics, poems that are looking to really throw the question of gender up in the air and show how we can start to communicate with each other authentically about stuff that really matters. So, anti-oppressive education is largely looking at identity, power relationships that come from that, the classroom politics of how different identities are navigating within that space, the languages that are used, and is looking towards pedagogical deconstruction and reconstruction of our learning institutions so that we can make them more efficient and better as a whole. So it's these three, dialogue, democratic theory, and anti-oppressive education, that I can speak at more length about, if you'd like, but this is where I'm grounding basically all of my work from here on out. We need dialogue so that we can sit and have the space together and co-construct ideas. We need democratic theory to make sure that we are doing that in a way that is non-tyrannical, even though dialogue does admit to its heritage to democratic theory in general, but I think it's important to mark this out specifically especially when we're recrafting our institutions. And then anti-oppressive education gives a richer understanding of both dialogue and democratic theory by bringing in identity politics and looking specifically at institutional construction in terms of the way that it can manipulate power. Now, in addition to these three arenas of philosophy that I'm playing in, I also have a couple of other, directions that I'm looking towards. These ideas down here are not quite as robust and filled out, but I have done a little bit of research. I would recommend that you go onto edutopia.org, which is a website for students and teachers and administrators to go on and share pedagogical philosophy that actually works in terms of how it is functioning within different schools or programs and so forth. This is where I got a good bit of my information, and I highly recommend it as a resource to anyone who is interested in pedagogical development. So what do we have down here? Well, first, this idea of differentiated instruction and evaluation. This is essentially just a fancy way of saying, hey, you need multiple methods of instruction. You can't just stand up and lecture and expect everything to get through. That in of itself is maintaining a particular kind of privilege. Same thing with evaluation. We actually want a number of different ways of going about things in recognizing, because we have to recognize the differences in where people are coming from, their identities, their learning strengths, their histories, and so forth. Arts integration, we already have a good portion of that within the MPhil program and being able to submit an art project for final evaluation. Arts integration is actually advocating for arts to be brought in the actual learning process in and of itself. Let's draw and color within class and map out things, or do an interpretive dance that's showing the how economics works. My high school did it. It's actually quite possible. Facilitation, this isn't coming specifically from Utopia, this is more my background in facilitation work that I've done. I've been trained by QPerg in Montreal as well as Community in Vancouver to be a facilitator, and this is coloring a lot of the stuff that I'm doing just in terms of the practice that I've had access to until this point. Critical pedagogy of place, this is looking at specifically how physical spaces affect the way that we have conversations, the types of things we think about, the way that we think about them. This is saying that physicality is important and that we need to actually be very conscious about how we are setting up our physical spaces, because our bodies matter just as much as our minds, as even though we don't particularly like to realize that. Critical pedagogy of place has a lot to say about the box classrooms where you've got the rows of students lined up and the teacher up at the front, saying that this particular model is no longer serving us and is a problematic remnant of the industrial age. Finally, this idea of authentic and blended assessment. Assessment and metrics of evaluation that are looking at taking into account the whole person and the real authentic experience that people have with content. Blended assessment is looking at having different modes of assessment, even within the scope of the same final project, to make sure that that we are measuring the right things, or actually being able to see the quality of content that is going on within a person's mind. So, working from the premises of dialogue, of democratic theory and anti-oppressive education, and being guided by these sort of smaller ideas of differentiation, arts integration, facilitation, pedagogy of place, and an authentic assessment. These are what I am working with when I am working towards restructuring the MPhil program. If you have any further questions, I'd be happy to answer them at the defense.